So hello, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful webinar. My name is Felina Fleck. I'm the Assistant Director of the Graduate and International Programs Office here at University of San Diego. We take care of all our LLM and Masters of Law programs. And I'm so happy to be joined today here by Professor Mackenzie. She's a visiting professor of environmental law here at USD and also professor and dean of degrees at Oxford's University Green Templeton College. Before starting her career at the university system, she served as pro-vice chancellor of the University of New England in Australia. And she was also employed by the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the United Nations. So thank you so much for bringing your vast majority of experience to us and for sharing your insights. I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Feline, and welcome, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I am indeed going to talk about a subject close to my heart, both academically and professionally. And as we have mentioned, we actually have a class in this at University of San Diego. So this afternoon is just a 55-minute canter through the key points in this topic, and perhaps a taster for anyone who might be interested in that class. Now, I really am going to canter through this material. If I'm going too quickly at any point, please just put something in the chat or jump in. I will not be remotely offended if you just jump in without raising your hand or anything else. And if there is anything that doesn't make sense to you, again, you're very welcome to ask. Oh, and now my screen has stuck. Okay, so we're going to start by simply an overview of the key areas of law. Now, when we put peace, war, and the environment together, we're in an area of law that is somewhat dysfunctional. There is no single area of law, no single textbook, no single treaty that would take us through this area of law. So it's a patchwork. It's a patchwork framed by the principles of international law, such as the UN Charter. At times, it veers into international humanitarian law, which you may also know as the law of armed conflict. If you have served in the military of any sovereign state, you may well have covered some of the law of armed conflict in your training. We also look at international environmental law, at issues such as biodiversity protection, forest protection, clean water, food security. We look at international criminal law, and in particular, how to deal with those who carry out the worst forms of international crimes, such as genocide. And at times, we touch on international human rights law too. So this is very much a patchwork of law. And I have put national law down at the bottom of this slide, because of course, if we are in a conflict situation, it's likely that national law has failed, because the aim of most national legal systems is the rule of law, the maintenance of peace and security. So it is only when these systems fail that we turn to these other areas of international law. So in theory, in a conflict situation, we would be guided by the law of the host state. But the reality is that that law has probably broken down. Let's pause, though, just briefly to think about the different types of legal systems in which we may be operating. Generally, globally, there are three big categories of legal system. There is the civil law legal system, the Sharia law legal system, and the common law legal system. So let's speak very briefly about each of these three as an introduction to the international legal system, where the three come together. Now, if we go back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire, we're looking here at a picture of ancient Rome. Of course, it's a modern photo, but this is a building. These are buildings that are around 2,000 years old. A couple of things might strike you about this photograph. The first is that the building is built of probably marble, valuable stone. The stone is not found in the region of Rome. It was probably carried to Rome from a region south of the Alps. So this required a great deal of human labor. The Roman Empire expanded. It expanded northwards into Europe, southwards into North Africa and the Middle East, incorporating into it the people of those regions, giving them, or perhaps dumping on them, the Roman legal system, and taking from them their freedom, their goods, their stone, their valuables, incorporating it all into an empire. That's pretty much how empires operate. They expand. There's a number of different ways in which it is lawful to acquire territory. We would look at those in more detail in an international law class. But for now, the point is the Roman Empire, and before it the Greek Empire, expanded. They gave their legal system to the territories into which they expanded. And that is the origin of the civil law legal system. In the civil law legal system, a judge looks at the law book, the law text, applies that text to the problem, and tries to reach a solution. Case law does not have a dominant role in a civil law legal system. And civil law is now the legal system of Mexico, most of South America, most of mainland Europe, China, and a number of other South Asian countries. That's our first legal system. Our next legal system is the legal system created by the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of the Islamic faith. We're looking here at a beautiful painting. It's likely to be depicting the Prophet and his followers, his apostles, disciples, followers, going in pilgrimage to Mecca. And you'll see that they're traveling on horseback. In reality, they were probably on camels. What is clear is they're not carrying much. This is a legal system that is not based on extensive written work, or at least it wasn't originally. It's a legal system that bases its authority on the holy book of the Islamic faith, the Holy Quran. And the Quran is both the religious text and the law. There are different ways of interpreting the Quran. Quranic judges are trained in different schools of interpretation, but the basic legal text is the Quran itself. And that gives us our second legal system, the Sharia law legal system. That legal system is found in Saudi Arabia, and it's found in conjunction with other legal systems in a number of other countries. In Egypt, for example, there's a hybrid legal system comprising Quranic Sharia law, civil law, and common law. And that corresponds with Egypt's mixed history of being fundamentally a Muslim country, but having had French and English colonization. In Indonesia, the largest Islamic country globally, there is a mixture of Islamic law and Dutch common law from the period of time when Indonesia was a Dutch colony. Much of the Middle East uses a mixture of Sharia law and common law for its commercial contracts. So that's our second legal system. Moving on to our third legal system, the common law legal system, we're looking here at a picture depicting one of the important parts of the common law legal history. Anybody know what we're looking at? This is King Richard of England signing the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is the big, Magna is big, Carta is law, the big charter, in which he bargains to get the loyalty of the men on the left-hand side of the picture. They're big landowners. He needs their loyalty because the French are about to invade. So he needs to raise an army. So King Richard gives away part of his absolute power and creates a parliamentary system in which law is made by the elected representatives of the people. That gave us the British Parliament, which is now a bicameral, a two-house legislature, lawmaking body. The United States created a similar system with a bicameral legislature, as did most of the common law world. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Nigeria, South Africa, India, and many other countries. And in this common law legal system, the court looks both at the law made by the legislature, but also at case law. And we call case law precedent. So this is our third and our most recent legal system. But you'll see that I didn't mention an international legal system in my brief description of those three origins. And that's because the international legal system is still some time ahead. So we're now going to canter through the next 700 or 800 years to get to the international legal system. We're cantering past the Crusades, in which Europeans galloped into the Middle East to try and claim the Middle East for the Christian God. And in return, people from the Middle East galloped into Europe to try and claim Europe for the Islamic God. This is probably a Christian painting because the painter has put the castle, the Christian castle with its chapel, in the forefront and the mosque at the back. Of course, this is art, not a photograph. So it's probably simply a Christian artist attempting to depict power. We're also going to canter forward to the Treaty of Westphalia. A treaty is a bilateral or trilateral or multilateral agreement between sovereign states in which sovereign states get together, they write the treaty, they sign it, they take it home and ratify it, approve it domestically, and are then bound by its contents. And in this treaty, signed in Westphalia in Germany in 1648, it both ended some war in Europe, but more importantly, it created a system of sovereign states. And in our system of sovereign states, every state respects the boundaries of other states and vice versa. We have jurisdiction over our territory. We have jurisdiction to make law, so to prescribe law, and jurisdiction to enforce law. And most sovereign states have a judiciary, a legislature, which is a lawmaking body, and an executive. The executive is the public service that carries out the law. So that includes the public service itself, and also the police, the courts, the military, the customs, and other enforcement agencies. And you know, it doesn't really matter what we call the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. The point is, all sovereign states that are stable have these institutions. And that gets us to unstable sovereign states and conflict. Because one of the key features of an unstable sovereign state is the fact that it often continues to make law, to prescribe law, but it lacks capacity to enforce that law. So very often we will have law that exists on paper. It will look like a law. If you read it, it will sound like a law. But there is no enforcement agency, or the enforcement agency lacks capacity to fully enforce, or perhaps it's corrupt and is simply not willing to enforce against certain people or certain institutions. And that is a key sign of the breakdown of the rule of law. Because remember, the rule of law requires equality before the law. It requires that all of us are equal under the law, all people and all institutions. And typically in a conflict situation, we will get breakdown of that rule of law. And sadly, in some of our most unstable states globally, that breakdown of the rule of law means that there is simply no enforcement. And clearly, for governments, that's problematic. Because if a government can't enforce the law, then typically there is going to be an increase in crime, both low-level crime, street riot, shoplifting, and so forth. But there will also be an increase in crime at a higher, more strategic level. We may have problems with the military chain of command. We may have problems with customs, with borders, with drugs. The government itself may stop being accountable to the people. These are the sort of issues that we have to deal with in conflict. And that's why it is so important that we have lawyers who understand both national law, but also the relationship between national and international law. Because very often in conflict, national law has broken down, and so we're relying on international law as our framework. Moving on through our, our brief survey, we get to the Crimea War. This was a war between Ukraine and Russia. Sadly, that's become all too common. That led to the creation of the International Commission of the Red Cross. It's likely you've seen the Red Cross operating in the United States or wherever else you may be this afternoon. And the ICRC was founded by 12 Swiss physicians, doctors, who were concerned about widows and orphans in conflict. In fact, its role has been extended. It now has an environmental section that is particularly concerned about environmental degradation in conflict and the relationship between conflict and deliberate damage to the environment. So that's where we're going next. But before we go there, we need to look at a couple of key historical events en route. We're looking here at the Al Saud family. By virtue of good strategy, they, like many other families, were nomadic. They and their camels and goats traveled around the region that we now call the GCC in North Africa, looking for water. By a series of strategic moves, they were able to establish the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1902 to unify Saudi into a kingdom. That led to stability in the Gulf region, but just as the Gulf was becoming stable, Europe was not. So conflict then broke out in Europe in 1914. The United States joined that conflict. We're looking here at trench warfare on the Western Front, probably in Belgium. You'll see soldiers in a trench. You'll see that they're sitting on a piece of wood in the trench. They've put wood in the trench to keep their feet up out of the trench, to keep their feet dry. It was very muddy, heavy rainfall in that region. That led to deliberate deforestation. Now, often there is damage to forests in conflict, but this was deliberate deforestation. Trees were being cut down to line the trenches on both sides, both the British and the German side, to keep soldiers up out of the muddy ground. Why is that significant? Well, it's incredibly significant. The reason for that is that there's no real problem cutting down a tree if you plant a few more trees. But the people who are responsible for planting trees in England and Europe around 1914 were the peasants, the poor agricultural workers. And they were precisely the people who joined the army. They joined the army because it gave them some hot meals every day, a free uniform, a little bit of payment, things they hadn't had before. So they were in the army and not at home planting trees. Trees in Europe take around 30 years to grow if they are coniferous trees, that's pointy Christmas trees. They take around 80 years to grow if they're deciduous, like an oak tree. So if you don't plant any trees because your men have gone to war, then you're going to get a gap in timber 30 years later. Now, it wasn't just men who went to war in 1914, it was little boys who went to war. boys as young as 12, 13 and 14 lied about their age to join the German and the British Army. They were the people who would have been at home working on the family farm. This means that there was no planting of trees until the next generation grew up. So there was a planting gap throughout most of Europe from 1914 to 1926. Add 30 years to that, the length of time it takes to grow a tree, and you get a timber shortage from 1944 to about 1960. And that is just when Europe needed timber to reconstruct after the Second World War. That meant that architecture switched to concrete in the late 1940s and the 1950s. It gives us the brutalist concrete architecture of that period because there was no timber for construction. Concrete has a life expectancy of around 70 or 80 years. It is absolutely full of carbon emissions. So the concrete that was used in 1945, 50, 55, 60 is now at the end of its life expectancy. It is now breaking down and it is giving us more carbon emissions, carbon being released from that concrete, just at a time when we are trying to deal with climate. Now, that's just one example, but there are many, many other examples of conflict from roughly 100 years ago that are now having environmental impact. But let's move on again. We're moving now to the Treaty of Montevideo, signed at Uruguay in 1933. And this defines what a state is. Why is this important? Well, it's critically important because it's states, sovereign states that make treaties. It's sovereign states that join the UN. If you're not a sovereign state, you can't join the UN, you can't make a treaty. And so we need to know who a sovereign state is. Here's the definition that the parties came up with. Permanent population. Well, that might be a problem. If your population is displaced, if you've got forcible displacement, for example, during conflict, if you're in the Democratic Republic of Congo and you have to flee, if you're in Nicaragua or El Salvador and you have to flee, you're no longer permanent population. And if your whole population flees, are you still a state? Or if your whole population is nomadic, if you get on your camel or your goat and off you go to look for water right across the Gulf or North Africa, are you permanent? If you're illiterate, if there's no property register in your country, if property is routinely seized, how do you demonstrate your link with land? So these are questions that any nation has to think about if it has got forcible displacement. Define territory. Not really a problem for a nation with stable borders, a serious problem for a nation that is subject to conflicting territorial claims. Palestine is a great example. Of course, there are territorial claims between India and Pakistan. There are territorial claims in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, many others globally. So this second point is always an issue. Government, well, if you're in a democratically elected state, government may be just fine. If you are in a state controlled by warlords, if the government doesn't control the state, clearly we've got another problem here. And capacity to enter into relations with other states, that's not recognition. Recognition is a formal means in which a country used to send a telegram to another saying, we, the Federation of the United States, recognize you, Cuba. In fact, the United States never sent that telegram. And we don't send telegrams anymore. But this is not recognition. This is a lower form of relations with other states. This simply means that if your air traffic controllers talk to the air traffic controllers of the state that you're about to land in, if your trains cross the border, if this train signals work, that's recognizing another state. And that means that we recognize states that we don't in fact recognize. That's a weird statement, but if, of course, if the United States is landing a plane in Afghanistan, of course it's talking to Afghan air traffic controllers, even though the United States may not formally recognize the government of Afghanistan. Now, in fact, it does. The issue is simply that the government of Afghanistan does not control all of Afghanistan. And so there we've got an issue with who makes law for the whole of Afghanistan. Now, these are exactly the sort of issues that we need to think about when we start to think about peace, war, and environment. There's no point in asking a government why it's not enforcing its biodiversity law if that government doesn't control the whole country. And equally, there's no point in asking government why it's not enforcing its biodiversity law to stop its people eating monkeys or elephants if that's the only form of protein they've got, or if the elephant is causing immense damage to the agricultural farmland and animals that are the only source of protein. These are the sort of really troubled issues we think about when we think about peace, war, and the environment. We also can look at why people turn to things like piracy and terrorism. In Somalia, and for example, there is still a great deal of piracy on the coast. That's hardly surprising when there's no other way for a young man to earn a living. The government does not control the coast and its waters. The Navy is not functioning. So many other countries are unlawfully fishing in those waters. There is overfishing. This means that subsistence fishermen who might in the past have been able to catch enough to feed their families can no longer do so because the area is overfished by other nations. Naturally, those fishermen have turned to piracy. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that piracy is a great thing to do, but we need to look not simply at the act of piracy, but what has caused that. And typically, it is breakdown of the rule of law in the host state. Now, moving on, we're back in the Middle East now. That stability that we talked about in Saudi, created by the unification of the kingdom, that led to the establishment of modern infrastructure. It led to investment in the region and discovery of oil in a region called Daman at well number 7 in 1938. And it's that discovery of oil that transformed the world. About a quarter of the world's oil is still under that rock in Daman. That is an enormous amount of oil. It's given us oil-dependent economies, created the fuel for the Second World War, the fuel for aircraft fuel. It enabled aircraft to undertake long-range bombing, massive aerial bombing throughout Europe, throughout Japan, the east of China, and the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 that led to the end of the Second World War. That led to the creation of the United Nations in 1945, the creation of the International Court of Justice, and moving forward, massive use of technology in the 1950s and 60s as wartime technologies like nuclear technology, were converted to peacetime use. The United States, by this time, had a pretty stable, increasingly wealthy population. I'm not for a moment claiming that everybody in the United States had enough to eat in the 1950s, that everybody was prosperous. But the United States was certainly reasonably stable. The GI Bill put a lot of people into college in the 40s and 50s. They came out of college, married, settled, populated the coastal regions, in particular Southern California, and demanded more and more food. That led to intensive agriculture, particularly in the Midwest. That led to runoff of pesticides used in that intensive agriculture, running off onto the coastal regions, Dr. Rachel Carson, an organic chemist, went for a walk on the beach with her dog in 1962, and indeed in other years too. Noticed the pesticides on the beach, noticed that the birds were no longer singing. Their habitat had been destructed. I'm sorry, it had been destroyed. I'm sorry, I'm losing the plot here. Their habitat had been destroyed by the pesticides. So she wrote a book, Silent Spring. And this is the beginning of the United States environmental movement. At about the same time, it was the middle of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were rushing to get to space. That led to the UN establishing the Office for Outer Space Affairs. It made a series of 5 treaties: how to get married in space, how to register a birth in space, because it was genuinely believed we were going to live in space. Remember those early episodes of Star Trek? Space was the final frontier. There was nowhere left on Earth to go. There had been an Antarctic Treaty in 1950 to keep the Antarctic stable, peaceful, and pristine. The Soviet Union had pushed northwards into the far north of Kazakhstan. There was simply nowhere left to go, so we were going to live in space. It was a time of great adventure. It was a happy time, a time when 2 nations were both in a race to get to outer space first. But we didn't go to space. We went to Vietnam instead, bringing with us Agent Orange. If you look at the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see orange smoke there. That's Agent Orange, DDT. It's a defoliage agent. Defoliage means to take the leaves off trees. If we'd time, we would look at this little video clip. We don't have time today, but please do look at it in your spare time. Why was the United States using defoliage agents? Well, it wanted to look into the forest to see the enemy hiding in the forest, so it needed the leaves to fall off the trees. This is the first time that we used environment as a method and means of warfare. In the past, there had been extensive environmental destruction, deforestation, for example, in the First World War, the collateral damage from aerial bombing in the Second World War. But now, for the first time, environmental damage is used as a means and method of war. The environment itself becomes the weapon, taking the leaves off trees. That led to early environmental law. In the 1970s and 80s, nations began to get together to make a series of early treaties about trade in wildlife, preservation of wetlands. But it's really only in 1992 that we get concerted effort for modern environmental law. In 1992, there was a conference at Rio. 192 nations showed up, along with about 10,000 NGOs. And they created these 5 documents. The first 2, the Rio Declaration and Agenda 21, are non-binding. The next 2 are treaties, binding agreements between 2 or more sovereign states, the Convention on Biodiversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the 5th are the non-binding forest principles. Non-binding because deforestation by 1992 was a significant issue globally. In Southeast Asia, timber was being cut down in order to supply the building trade in Southeast Asia and now the building trade in China and India. There is huge demand for the lowest possible cost timber. And in the Amazon basin, forests were being burnt, destroyed, to clear the land for agriculture. So 2 different causes of deforestation, but a similar outcome. Now, just about the same time as this push forward environmentally was the end of the Cold War. So for the first time, nations stopped looking at each other. And instead, the focus was on less stable nations, typically in sub-Saharan Africa, but in other parts of the world too. This led to the massive expansion of UN peacekeeping. There have been peacekeepers since 1947, but it was in the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, when both sides stopped controlling their own, that the focus shifted to massive expansion of UN peacekeeping. And in my Peace, War and Environment class, we focus on that peacekeeping. We look at the law underpinning it, and we look at the 16 current peacekeeping missions. So the next few minutes are a summary of peacekeeping. One of the biggest issues that peacekeepers often have to deal with are bad guys, typically corrupt heads of state, corrupt warlords, corrupt governments. Very often there have been really serious international crimes, crimes like genocide, massive breaches of the Geneva Conventions. For that purpose, the International Criminal Court was established in the year 2000. It's located at The Hague in the Netherlands. It looks like a regular court. It seeks to bring to justice the very worst offenders of international law. The United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. That is an interesting move on the part of the United States. There's a number of reasons for it, and we discuss those reasons in depth in my Peace, War and Environment class. We also look at the trials that have taken place. Those include the trials of warlords from Liberia, trials of warlords from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and trials of a number of other particularly unpleasant individuals. We look at the impact of 9/11. In particular, we look at the United States' 20 years involvement in the Middle East. We look at the evacuation of Kabul. That was the very rapid exit from Afghanistan that took place in August 2021. This is a photo of the inside of a C-130, a Hercules. This is the last United States transport flight that left. We look at environmental degradation caused by forced migration. This photo was taken just about 12 miles south of the University of San Diego. We have the luxury of a stunningly beautiful campus at USD. You don't need to drive very far south to meet people who do not have that luxury. We look at the basis of peacekeeping. We find that in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. We look in detail at that chapter. We look at the procedure for UN intervention. And we look at the nature of a peacekeeping mission, whether it's an observer mission, like the mission between India and Pakistan, which just has around 70 people observing the border. Or we look at the very large missions in Central African Republic, missions in South Sudan, missions in DRC, Congo, which have around 15,000 peacekeepers on the ground. We spend a lot of time looking at current peacekeeping operations, at food security, environmental degradation, the conduct of governance in those regions. And we look at the peacekeeping budget. And I'm going to pause here because this is important. The budget for the last fiscal year, this current fiscal year, it's 5.6 billion. If you go to the UN website on this PowerPoint slide, you'll find the breakdown of the budget. You'll find out how much each of our 16 peacekeeping missions cost. And you'll find the principles of financing, how that money is raised. Here are the top 10 contributors to peacekeeping. You'll see that the United States is contributing 26% of the budget, China 18%, and a number of other countries all contribute a little bit. Those two top figures are important. Those are the two countries that are effectively keeping the world stable right now. Now, you may query my choice of language there. I struggle with that language, but the reality is that without peacekeeping, the world would be a great deal less stable than it currently is. And we need that 26% from the United States. We need the 18% from China. And we need whatever other percent anybody else can contribute in order to, I suppose, at the lowest level, to at least prevent further genocide in troubled regions. I would love to put it at a higher level, to say we're talking about environmental protection, that we're dealing with high-flying carbon neutral plans in South Sudan. But the reality is we're down at the level of preventing genocide. That's where our money is going. And I would like to think that it's good use of that money. And who are those peacekeepers? Those women and men with the blue berets, where do they come from? Well, here's another interesting statistic. The UN has really detailed figures of exactly where they come from month by month. These are the figures for January, 2 or 3 months ago. Have a look at the number of peacekeepers relative to the population of the country. Nepal, the population of 30 million, is sending 6,000. China, with a population of 1.4 billion, is sending 1,800. Ireland, 5 million, sends 372. On a per capita ratio, Ireland is the world's largest contributor to peacekeeping. On a funding basis, the United States is the largest contributor to peacekeeping. On a funding basis relative to GDP per capita, China is the world's largest contributor to peacekeeping. On a population basis, the United States, with 333 million and 26 blue beret people, is the lowest contributor to peacekeeping. So there's a number of different ways we can look at these figures. And in my class, we look at these figures in some detail, because they are telling us about economics of peacekeeping. They're telling us about the ethics, the morality of peacekeeping. They're also telling us about standards of living in the countries that send peacekeepers. All military are paid their own salary by their government. Typically, those salaries vary considerably. A United States enlisted soldier might start at $25,000, $30,000 a year. A senior officer in the United States military might be paid $150,000, $180,000 a year. An enlisted woman in the army in Nepal might start at around $500, $600 a year. A senior officer in the Nepal army might make less than $10,000 a year. Now, when you send someone to peacekeeping, the UN gives your country money. It gives you $1,400 per soldier per month. So the UN is paying Nepal, Rwanda, Bangladesh, India, China, and others to send each soldier per month. Some countries are profiting from peacekeeping. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe one way of thinking of this is a transfer of aid from United States and China to Nepal, Rwanda, and Bangladesh. Maybe another way of thinking of it is that a soldier from Nepal, Rwanda, Bangladesh may well be better equipped to serve in an underdeveloped country than a United States or an Irish or a French soldier. They may well be more accustomed to the living conditions of an underdeveloped country than a soldier from a more highly developed country. There's a number of different ways of thinking about this. These are the sort of issues we think about in my Peace, War, and Environment class. And a key point that we look at is the link between peacekeeping and environment. That link was established in 2003. Now think about the timing. The UN had been peacekeeping from 1947 onwards, But it was only in 2003 that the link between peace and environment was made by the UN. And it was made in Liberia. The reason for that is in Liberia, conflict diamonds were paying for a lot of the conflict. It's easy to smuggle a diamond, swallow it. It's a lot more difficult to smuggle an elephant tusk. So diamonds were being smuggled out. They were being smuggled to Amsterdam and Tel Aviv, cleaned, polished, sold. The money sent back to Liberia to warlords to buy more weapons. Liberia had particularly valuable biodiversity. It's a tropical country, hot. The infrastructure had been trashed by 40 years of conflict. That's very positive from a biodiversity point of view, because it means it's difficult to fell trees and ship the timber out. The UN recognized that biodiversity in Liberia was still worth protecting, but that money was pouring in to buy weapons. And so as part of the peacekeeping mandate, peacekeepers were directed for the first time ever in peacekeeping by Security Council Resolution 1509 of 2003 to assist the transitional government, so the transitional government of Liberia, in the proper administration of natural resources. It's just one line, but that is the first occasion from 1947 onwards when the UN directed that the peacekeepers be involved in the proper administration of natural resources. So that was a really significant step forward in peacekeeping. And it means that from 2003 onwards, so for the last 20 years, peacekeeping has been very much involved in the proper administration of natural resources. Since then, we have had United Nations Environment Programme involved in disaster management, in post-conflict assessment and capacity building. We are still globally, though, working with the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, which set out the law of armed conflict, and 3 additional protocols. 2 of those additional protocols mention environment. Additional Protocol 1 of 1977, immediately after Vietnam. So again, Agent Orange was used, AP1 then was enacted, prohibits widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. The United States is not a party to AP1. It is a party to the Geneva Conventions, but it chose not to sign AP1. And the United States is also not a party to NMOD, a convention on the prohibition of military or hostile environmental modification techniques. That NMOD treaty has very similar language, prohibiting widespread, long-term and severe environmental damage. We also look at international human rights law. We look at the Refugee Convention. We look at definitions of refugees. Generally, a refugee, according to the 1951 Convention, is someone who is fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership of particular groups. Climate is not in that definition. Now, we wouldn't expect climate to be in a 1951 definition. Climate wasn't on the agenda in 1951. But what that means now is that if someone is forced to leave their home, their livelihood, because, for example, of a rising sea level, because their land has become inaccessible or flooded, they will not qualify for protection as a refugee. This means that they are likely to remain permanently displaced, either within their own country or in a third-party state, but they will not qualify as for resettlement because they don't meet the international definition of refugee. That means typically that they are going to spend the rest of their life in a refugee camp, dependent on international aid, dependent at best on the informal economy of a refugee camp. And there are parts of the world now where we already have 3 generations of families in refugee camps, people who were displaced in the late 1940s, 1950s, have never been resettled, albeit for different reasons. If, for example, sea levels were to rise now, potentially around 80 million people globally will be displaced by rising sea levels and will not meet this definition of refugee. So that again is a humanitarian problem that is foreseeable and is not currently within the capacity of international law. We also look at criminalizing. We look at what happens if you do breach these obligations. And we look at current conflicts. In my class over the last few weeks, it's now a month ago, we looked at the Israel and Palestinian conflict. We looked at Haiti and we looked at South Sudan. We also looked at piracy and we also looked at stolen art. Now that's just a brief overview of what happens in my environment and conflict class. But I'm going to hand you back now to Feline, to our Director of International Programs in our international office, who could tell you more about our programs. So thank you very much indeed for staying with me. I would be happy to take very brief questions, but I think time is short, so let me hand you straight back over.
Thank you so much, Professor McKenzie. This was incredible, and I wish I was in law school to attend your class. Thank you so much for such a rich overview. As we're seeing if there's any questions that might come up, I just wanted to go ahead and share my screen to kind of just give you a little idea of what we offer here in our office, the LLM in US Law, designed for international students that hold a JD equivalent degree from a foreign country. This one is online, our new program, which we wanted to get the word out about. We also have a bunch of really good LLM programs for JD holders on our campus with a lot of different concentration areas, including environmental and energy law. So if you are ever interested, please check us out. I will share my information in the chat if anyone is interested. And yes, thank you everyone so much for joining. I will put everything in the chat right now if we have some questions. In the meantime, please feel free to unmute yourself. Otherwise, it was such a brilliant presentation that not much is left to doubt.
Well, Feline, one point I have made is that typically students doing a US LLM are interested in, passing the bar, which is, pretty key point. And very often they are interested in commercial law, banking, tax, those sort of subjects. We would absolutely encourage you to take those sort of subjects if that's what's interested you. But of course, you can take one or two other classes, this sort of class, for your own interest. So don't think that you have to choose one or the other. Of course, you can specialize in commercial subjects and United States law, but take one or two broader subjects just because they're interesting things for you to take.
Yes, and we have a lot of amazing professors like Professor McKenzie here that really enrich a student's experience. So thank you so much for dedicating your time to us and taking time out of your busy day. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you here on campus for a visit. Thank you, everyone.
We would love to. Thank you, Feline, for coordinating this, and thank you, students, for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.